The umbrella that stopped Harlem. Harlem in the late 1940s didn't move slowly. It pulsed, it breathed, it argued with itself in jazz clubs and prayed with itself in storefront churches. It was loud, proud, wounded, brilliant. And on that particular afternoon, it was raining. Not a gentle rain, the kind that slapped sidewalks and turned streets into mirrors, the kind that made people rush, except for one man. Bumpy Johnson walked calmly down 135th Street with a black umbrella in his hand. He didn't hurry. He didn't flinch. Rain tapped against the umbrella like impatient fingers, but he moved at his own rhythm. People noticed him the way people notice gravity, not because it demands attention, but because it exists. He wore a dark overcoat, pressed and sharp, a fedora tilted just enough to mean something. His eyes weren't scanning for danger, they were scanning for imbalance. Bumpy understood power, but what most people misunderstood was this: he understood responsibility even more. Across the street, a small crowd gathered under the awning of a grocery store. Harlem always gathered around noise, laughter, arguments, celebration, sorrow. This time, it wasn't laughter. It was a scream. Not a theatrical scream, not a dramatic one. A mother's scream. And that kind doesn't echo, it pierces. Everything slowed. The umbrella stopped mid-step. Bumpy didn't ask what happened. He listened. There are sounds that trained ears recognize immediately. He knew panic when he heard it. Not anger, not street theatrics. Panic. He crossed the street without rushing, without announcing himself. Under the awning stood a woman soaked in rain, hair clinging to her face, eyes wide with terror. She clutched nothing, and that was the problem. "My boy," she gasped. "He can't breathe. Somebody help my boy." On the ground beside her lay a child, no older than 6. His small body was rigid, lips faintly blue, chest struggling in uneven jolts. Harlem could handle fights, it could handle pride, it could handle fear. But a child gasping for air, that silenced even the toughest men. People froze. No one wanted to do the wrong thing. And that hesitation, that split second, can be fatal. Bumpy closed his umbrella. He knelt. No grand speech, no dramatic gesture, just calm. "What happened?" he asked quietly. "He was running," the mother sobbed. "He has asthma. He left his inhaler at home. I tried." Bumpy raised a hand gently. "Breathe," he told her. "If you panic, he panics." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. He removed his coat and folded it under the boy's head to lift him slightly. He loosened the child's collar. He tilted him just enough to open his airway. "Go," he said to a young man in the crowd. "Pharmacy, 2 blocks. Tell them it's urgent." The young man didn't argue. He ran. Rain poured harder. Bumpy shielded the child with his own body, umbrella angled just right. His coat was getting soaked now. Didn't matter. "Stay with me, son. You're stronger than this," he murmured. The mother trembled beside him. "You're going to be all right," Bumpy said. And it wasn't empty reassurance. It was command. Something shifted in the crowd. People straightened. 2 women stepped forward, shielding wind. A man offered his scarf to help warm the child. Someone shouted to clear space. Harlem moved again, but now with purpose. Minutes stretch longer when a child struggles to breathe. The pharmacy runner returned, breathless, clutching medication. The pharmacist himself followed behind, having abandoned his counter without hesitation. Treatment was given, slowly, painfully slowly. Then, a gasp, a deeper one. The child's chest rose fully. Color crept back. The mother collapsed into tears of relief, and Harlem exhaled. Bumpy stood up quietly, placing the umbrella back over the mother now. She grabbed his hand. "I don't know how to thank you," she said through sobs. He shook his head. "Thank him," he nodded toward the boy. "He did the fighting." No theatrics, no collecting gratitude. But what happened next mattered more than the rescue. Across the street, leaning against a car, stood a tall, unmistakable figure watching everything unfold. Joe Louis had come to Harlem quietly that week, the brown bomber, a champion who carried the pride of a generation on his gloves. He had seen men freeze before. He had seen crowds hesitate, but he had also just seen something else. Joe Louis walked across the street slowly. Most men, said Bumpy, to only stop a fight when it's loud. Bumpy adjusted his wet hat. Life doesn't shout before it breaks, he replied. The two men looked at each other, not as legends, not as reputations, but as protectors of something bigger than themselves. Harlem didn't need kings. It needed guardians. Joe Louis glanced at the boy now sitting upright in his mother's arms. You didn't hesitate, Louis said. Bumpy gave a faint smile. When it's a child, he answered, there's no room for pride. The rain softened. People began to dispersing, whispering, but the story was already moving faster than the weather. That night, barbershops talked about it. Churches mentioned it. Street corners repeated it. Not because Bumpy Johnson was feared, but because he had stopped everything for a scream no one else moved fast enough to answer. And that changes how a city sees you. But Harlem's lessons never come one at a time. The mother would return, the boy would remember, and the umbrella, soaked and silent, would become a symbol of something no one expected from a man whose name usually traveled with tension. Because this was not the story of dominance, this was the story of restraint. And restraint is power most people never understand. When strength chooses restraint. The rain from that afternoon did more than soak coats and sidewalks. It washed something invisible across Harlem. By nightfall, the story had already traveled from Lenox Avenue to Sugar Hill, from barbershops humming with debate to kitchen tables where elders shook their heads thoughtfully. People did not repeat the story with fear in their voices. They repeated it with curiosity. There was something different about the way it unfolded. Harlem had seen dominance before. It had seen force, bravado, loud demonstrations of authority. What it had witnessed under that grocery store awning was something quieter, something steadier, something that required no announcement. By the following morning, the mother returned to 135th Street with her son walking beside her, bundled carefully in a thick sweater despite the clearing skies. She was not searching for attention. She was searching for the man with the umbrella. Harlem was not large in geography, but it was enormous in awareness. It did not take long for someone to point her towards a modest cafe where Bumpy Johnson often sat in the mornings, reading newspapers with the same calm he had shown in the storm. He was there when she arrived, coat dry, umbrella resting beside his chair, as though the previous day had been nothing more than weather. When she stepped inside, conversations lowered slightly. Respect in Harlem did not always arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrived with space. She approached him, her son clutching her hand, and before she could speak, Bumpy folded his newspaper neatly and looked at the boy first. The child held his gaze for a moment before shyly offering a quiet thank you. Bumpy nodded once and told him that strength does not come from fighting air. It comes from learning how to breathe through fear. The mother's gratitude spilled over in words that trembled but did not break. She spoke of hospitals, of bills, of worry that lived constantly in her chest. Bumpy listened, not interrupting, not offering immediate solutions, just listening. That, too, was rare power. Across town, Joe Louis had not forgotten what he saw. As a champion who carried the weight of representation in every punch he threw, he understood the fragile line between perception and reality. That afternoon had shown him something unexpected, a man known for influence choosing compassion over intimidation. Later that week, the two men met again, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a quiet corner of a community gym where young boys trained under flickering lights. The gym smelled of sweat and determination. Joe Louis watched as Bumpy stood near the ropes, observing a teenage fighter whose temper often outweighed his discipline. Instead of barking commands, Bumpy leaned forward and spoke to the boy about control, about how the loudest reaction is usually the weakest one. The boy listened,
perhaps because he sensed that these words were lived, not rehearsed. Word spread that Bumpy had quietly covered the pharmacy bill for the asthmatic child. He did not publicize it. He did not attach conditions. It simply happened. In neighborhoods where pride often prevented asking for help, quiet assistance created ripples that speeches never could. Shopkeepers began greeting him not merely out of obligation, but out of acknowledgement. Elders began referencing that rainy afternoon when discussing what leadership should look like. Harlem's memory is selective, but it remembers moments that reveal character. The umbrella had become symbolic because it was not dramatic, but because it shielded without demanding recognition. Yet power never exists in a vacuum. There were others who viewed this shift in perception with suspicion. Some men believed that strength must always be visible, that fear must always precede respect.
The night the crowd chose calm. Harlem had a way of building energy slowly, like steam rising from pavement after rain. The days following the incident with the boy did not explode into celebration. Instead, they settled into something more complicated. Respect had grown, but so had expectation. When a community witnesses strength wrapped in restraint, it begins to wonder whether that restraint can survive real confrontation. The neighborhood was watching now, not for dominance, but for consistency. And consistency is far harder to maintain than a single heroic moment. It began on a Friday evening outside the same gym where young boys trained under watchful eyes. Word had spread that a group of men from outside the neighborhood had been causing trouble, loud enough to unsettle shop owners and bold enough to provoke arguments. Tension simmered in clusters on the sidewalk. Voices grew sharper, postures stiffer. Harlem did not fear outsiders, but it did resent disrespect. By the time Bumpy arrived, umbrella in hand, though the sky remained clear, the atmosphere had thickened with that dangerous blend of pride and impatience. Crowds do not need instructions to escalate. They only need a spark. Joe Louis happened to be visiting that evening, speaking quietly with one of the gym trainers when raised voices spilled into the street. He stepped outside alongside Bumpy, and what they saw was not chaos yet, but it was close. Young men, shoulders squared, words thrown like punches, store owners hovering anxiously at doorways, mothers pulling children back by their wrists. The situation teetered on that thin edge where one shove could rewrite the night. Many expected Bumpy to assert control in the most visible way possible. Some even anticipated a public display of authority, the kind that leaves no room for argument. But he did something different. He stepped into the space between both groups and simply stood there. Not aggressively, not defensively, just present. Presence, when steady enough, has its own gravity. The arguments did not stop instantly, but their volume dipped, confusion flickering across faces that expected confrontation and found composure instead. He spoke slowly, addressing both sides without raising his voice. He reminded them that pride feels powerful in the moment, but costs more than it pays. He asked a simple question that silenced more effectively than any threat. What will this fix? The words lingered. No one had an answer. That is often the turning point in escalating conflict, when emotion outruns logic and someone dares to bring logic back into the room. Joe Louis watched carefully. As a champion who had faced roaring crowds, he understood how quickly energy can shift from admiration to frenzy. He also understood that leadership is not about overpowering emotion, but redirecting it. He stepped forward, reinforcing the calm rather than amplifying tension. He spoke about discipline, about how strength is measured not by how loudly you respond, but by how precisely you choose your response. His voice carried credibility earned in arenas far beyond Harlem's streets. The men who had arrived from outside the neighborhood seemed startled. They had expected resistance, maybe even retaliation. Instead, they encountered a wall of composure that made aggression feel unnecessary, even foolish. When one of them attempted to reignite the confrontation with a sharp remark, Bumpy did not retaliate verbally. He held eye contact long enough for the moment to feel heavy. Sometimes silence exposes insecurity more effectively than words ever could. The remark dissolved under its own weight. What happened next surprised many observers. Bumpy extended an invitation rather than a challenge. He suggested that if anyone wanted to prove something, they could step inside the gym and spar under supervision, rules enforced, respect required. It was a controlled alternative to chaos. Some scoffed, but a few accepted. Inside the gym, gloves were laced, boundaries established, tempers redirected into discipline. The crowd that had gathered outside followed cautiously, curiosity replacing hostility. Under the gym lights, something shifted. The same energy that threatened to fracture the evening was now channeled into measured movement. Punches thrown with control, footwork corrected, applause offered when deserved. The environment did not erase tension completely, but it transformed it into something productive. Even the shop owners who had braced themselves for damage began to relax. The asthmatic boy sat on the bleachers that night beside his mother, watching wide-eyed. He had seen fear freeze a crowd once before. Now he was witnessing fear dissolve into structure. To a child, that lesson embeds deeply. Strength is not about making others small. It is about making chaos smaller. Later, when the gym emptied and the street quieted, Joe Louis and Bumpy stood near the entrance as the cool air settled around them. Louis remarked that most leaders demand loyalty through fear. Bumpy replied that fear expires quickly. Respect renews itself. Their conversation was brief, but it carried weight. They both understood that moments like this redefine narratives more effectively than headlines. The following morning, Harlem spoke again. Not about a brawl, not about dominance, but about a night that could have spiraled and instead steadied. Mothers discussed it while sweeping stoops. Barbers dissected it between haircuts. Teenagers replayed it with admiration. The story of the umbrella had expanded into something broader, the story of a man who refused to let emotion dictate outcome. Of course, not everyone was convinced. There were still those who believed restraint was temporary, that sooner or later force would replace patience. But as days passed without retaliation, without escalation, that skepticism began to weaken. Influence had shifted from spectacle to stability, and stability, though less dramatic, is far more transformative. One evening, as dusk softened the skyline, Bumpy once again walked home carrying the same umbrella, now more symbolic than practical. He paused briefly near the grocery store where the mother's scream had once cut through rain. The street was calm. Children laughed nearby. A delivery truck rumbled past without incident. He did not smile broadly. He simply nodded to himself. Leadership does not celebrate loudly. It measures progress quietly. Harlem was learning that strength can kneel in the rain and stand firm in confrontation without changing its tone. The lesson was spreading beyond one block, beyond one incident, and as expectation grew heavier, so did the responsibility attached to it. The real test, however, was still coming, because calm is easy when the stakes are public. The deeper challenge arrives when loyalty is questioned in private and reputation tempts reaction. That storm was gathering.